Welcome to Unit 3, Grammar Teaching and Language Use. Welcome to this comprehensive exploration of grammar, its teaching methodologies, and practical applications in language use. Throughout this presentation, we'll examine the theoretical foundations of grammar, language acquisition processes, and the evolution from normative approaches to functional communicative perspectives. We'll investigate Chomsky's universal grammar theory, analyze how children acquire language, and trace the historical development of grammatical studies. This journey will provide valuable insights for linguists, language teachers, and anyone interested in understanding how grammar shapes our communication. Understanding linguistic systems, phonology, grammar, and lexicon. When linguists describe a language, they must address these three major components. Each component involves both form and meaning, with semantic specificality focusing on meaning across all three areas. Phonological semantics, meanings expressed through stress and intonation. Grammatical semantics, meanings associated with grammatical categories. And lexical semantics, meanings of vocabulary items. Phonology, the study of the sounds, the sound system of language, including consonants, vowels, stress patterns, and intonation. Grammar comprises morphology, form of words, and syntax, how words combine to form sentences. Lexicon, the vocabulary items, including words and idioms, with their pronunciation, grammatical behavior, and meaning. The concept of universal grammar, historical context, the connection between language philosophy and traditional branches of philosophy, like logic and epistemology, dates back to ancient times. The term logos itself can be translated as both reasoning and discourse, highlighting this relationship. Various philosophers have proposed that thought is a kind of inner speech, with systems of universal grammar developed particularly in the 13th and 18th centuries. Humboldt's contribution. Wilhelm von Humboldt, 1762-1835, emphasized that the diversity of language structure across languages determine how thought and experience are categorized. This perspective was later explained by the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, which proposed that language shapes thoughts and perceptions. Chomsky approach to universal grammar. Innovative perspective. Chomsky revived the universal grammar hypothesis, but approached it differently than his predecessors. While maintaining assumptions about the universality of logic and the interdependence of language and thought, he believed empirical language study had more to contribute to mind philosophy than vice versa. Unique contribution. Chomsky's originality lies in providing detailed arguments from the nature of language to the nature of mind, rather than the reverse approach traditionally taken. This shift fundamentally changed how linguistic arguments are conducted. Empirical foundation. Unlike earlier philosophical approaches, Chomsky theories are testable through empirical research, opening new adventures and avenues for investigating language and cognition. Interdisciplinary approaches to language, psycholinguistics, sociolinguistics, neurolinguistics, and cognitive science. The study of language has evolved into a rich interdisciplinary field. These interconnected disciplines draw upon linguistics, psychology, philosophy, and neuroscience to provide comprehensive insights into language acquisition, processing, and use. This multifaceted approach has revolutionized our understanding of how humans develop and utilize language. Psycholinguistics, the intersection of psychology and linguistics, studying how language is processed and acquired. Neurolinguistics examines the neurological basis for language and how the brain processes linguistic information. Sociolinguistics investigates how social factors influence language use and develop in communities. Cognitive science, broader field studying mental processes, including language, memory, and problem solving. Chomsky mentalism, challenging behaviorism. Mentalist position. Chomsky and his followers argue that language acquisition and use cannot be explained without appealing to mental principles beyond purely physiological accounts. This mentalism asserts the existence of mind without necessarily claiming it's a non-physical entity separate from the brain. Rejection of behaviorism. Chomskyan mentalism directly challenges behaviorist approaches that dominated American linguistics and psychology. Behaviorists insisted that mental phenomena were simply products of physical processes, a view Chomsky found inadequate for explaining language acquisition. This theoretical clash represented a fundamental shift in how researchers approach language study. By rejecting the limitations of behaviorist methodology, Chomsky opened new avenues for investigating the cognitive dimensions of language acquisition and processing. Chomsky posited a proposal of mind and knowledge, innate principles, structured mind, natural constraints. Chomsky's most original and controversial contributions centered on knowledge acquisition. Like earlier rationalists, he argued that the principles governing knowledge acquisition are innate. He rejects the empiricist view of the mind as a blank slate, tabula rasa, instead comparing it to Leibniz's analogy of a marble block whose structure constrains the sculpture's possibilities. Innate principles. The mind acquires knowledge through innate principles. Structured mind. The mind is not a blank slate, but has inherent structure. Natural constraints. Mental structure imposes constraints on knowledge acquisition. Language acquisition as knowledge acquisition. Philosophical question. Is concept possession a precondition for language acquisition? Language-thought connection. Can we distinguish between having a concept and knowing the word for it? Historical debate. Language acquisition has been central to rationalist empiricist debates for centuries. Language acquisition represents a specific instance of knowledge acquisition. The relationship between learning word meanings and developing concepts has been debated extensively. Does having appropriate concepts precede vocabulary acquisition? Or is the connection between language and thought so fundamental that we cannot separate concept possession from knowing the corresponding word? Chomsky's view on language innateness. Expression of thought. Chomsky followed the rationalist tradition in viewing language as serving to express thought. He believes humans are genetically endowed with the capacity to form certain concepts rather than others. Concept formation. For Chomsky, concept formation precedes word meaning acquisition. This aligns with rationalist predecessors, but his approach differs in significant ways. Focus on grammar. Unlike earlier rationalists, Chomsky emphasized that acquiring grammatical structure requires explanation as much as matching word meanings with forms. Innate faculty. He argues that language nature and acquisition process require an innate language acquisition faculty to be explicable. Structure dependency in language. Structure dependency is a key concept in Chomsky's theory. It means that linguistic rules apply to sequences with internal structure and make essential reference to this structure. For example, sentences have syntactic structure described through constituency, generated by phrase-structure grammar with structure-dependent rules. This property appears universal across human languages and is central to Chomsky's arguments for an innate language faculty. Universal property, found across all human languages. Internal structure, rules apply to sequences with internal organization. Foundational concept, essential to Chomsky's theory of language. The mind as abstract structures. Chomsky mental model. Chomsky describes the mind as a set of abstract structures with yet unknown physical basis. These structures are comparable to body organs, that develop according to genetic programming in interaction with the environment. The language faculty is one of many specialized mental structures, each performing specific functions. Empirical verification. This approach can be tested through experimental studies. Though carrying evidence from language acquisition research, language disorder studies, primate experiments, and neurophysiology remains inconclusive. However, relevant evidence constitutes and continues to accumulate, suggesting that this centuries-old philosophical debate may eventually be resolved through interdisciplinary empirical research. Language acquisition, terminology and scope. Acquisition versus learning, native versus foreign language. Neurophysiological implications. We must be conscious about applying conclusions from monolingual child language acquisition to foreign language teaching. The common argument, that's how you learn your native language, is invalid for second language acquisition. Normal children acquire their native language without special instruction, starting at similar ages and progressing through the same developmental stages. Acquisition versus learning. Linguists prefer acquisition over learning as it's neutral regarding physiological and psychological implications. However, some argue that if language is innate, it doesn't get acquired but naturally matures. Native versus foreign language. Language acquisition typically refers to native language development. Foreign language acquisition may follow different processes, especially after the critical age for language acquisition. Neurophysiological implications. Recent clinical observations of brain damaged bilinguals suggest second language acquisition has significant neurophysiological consequences, regardless of the acquisition age. Early phonological development. Birth to first days. Babies respond to human voices and distinguish between voiced and voiceless consonants from birth. Around 9 months, child begins acquiring intonation patterns of their native language and constructing their phonological system. First 6 months, child progresses from crying to cooing to babbling in an innately determined sequence. By 5 years, most phonological distinction mastered through some complex distinction may develop later. The early phonological response to voiced, voiceless distinction isn't necessarily evidence of innate universal distinctive features, as young chimpanzees show similar abilities. This suggests the ability may be common to higher primates, but only humans invested with linguistic function through exposure to language is where it's functional. Developmental sequence of babbling, crying, initial vocal communication, cooing, vowel-like sound emerge, babbling, consonant-vowel combination appears. Intonation patterns, acquiring language-specific prosody. This developmental sequence appears innately determined as the sounds produced in early stages are unaffected by linguistic environment. Even deaf children cry, coo, and initially babble like hearing children. During babbling, most children acquire some intonation patterns of their native language, though these patterns don't yet have distinctive communicative functions. Babbling prepares for speech, but whether this is its primary biological function remains disputed. Phonological system development, perception, production, practice, mastery. Perception, recognizing phonological distinctions in native language. Production, attempting to reproduce sounds heard in environments. Practice, refining pronunciation through repetition. Mastery, achieving adult-like pronunciation of sounds. Around 9 months, children begin constructing their phonological system. Individual development timing varies considerably, with no correlation to subsequent linguistic competence or intellectual ability. Babbling may overlap with early phonological developments, with clear differences between babbling and talking. Most phonological distinctions are mastered by age 5, though some complex distinctions develop later. Consonant acquisition follows established sequence, labials before dentals, alveolars and velars, stops before fricatives, oral stops before nasals. Grammatical development stages. Holophrasic period, 9 to 18 months. The child produces one-word sentences that function as complete thoughts. These single words often represent entire phrases or sentences in adult language. Telegraphic period begins with two-word utterances. Speech lacks inflation and function words like prepositions, determiners, and conjunctions. Content words are strung together like telegrams, focusing on meaning carrying elements. Developing complexity, continuing to age 4. Speech gradually improves in length and complexity, becoming more like adult speech. By age 4, speech is no longer telegraphic, though still not fully adult-like. Evidence suggests a developmental sequence for grammatical structures that is independent of the specific language being acquired. However, the term telegraphic has limited descriptive value for isolated languages like Vietnamese that lack morphological variation. The Chomskyan revolution in language acquisition studies. Pre-1960s. Little semantic investigation of grammatical structure acquisition. Early 1960s, Chomsky demonstrates language are rule-governed, specifically and especially in grammar. Mid-1960s, realization that existing learning theories couldn't explain acquisition of reductive rule-governed systems. Throughout the 1960s, psycholinguistics and psycholinguists focus almost exclusively on grammar in child language studies. Chomsky's work dramatically changed language acquisition research by highlighting the rule-governed nature of language and challenging existing learning theories. This shifted focus to grammar in child language studies throughout the 1960s, though opinion later broadened to recognize that grammatical competence cannot be studied in isolation from general cognitive, emotional, and social development. Broadening the scope of child language studies. Expanded content areas. Research now covers phonology, grammar, vocabulary, semantic structure, social interaction, and children's belief about the world, providing a more comprehensive understanding of language development. Pre-linguistic foundations. Significant research examines pre-linguistic determinants of grammar acquisition during crying, cooing, and babbling stages, revealing important developmental precursors. Extended timeline. Studies now recognize that mastery of grammatical structure may continue until age 10 or beyond, even when children's construction appear superficially grammatical. This broadened perspective doesn't invalidate innateness and species specificity hypotheses, or the idea that the language faculty is separate from other mental capacities. However, it does complicate the argument by revealing the extended timeline and complex interrelationships involved in language acquisition. Practical applications of language acquisition research. Speech therapy. Understanding normal and abnormal language acquisition helps speech therapists diagnose and treat language-related disabilities in children and adults. Educational materials. Teaching materials for primary school children can be improved by aligning vocabulary and grammar with children's actual linguistic competence. Assessment validity. Knowledge of language development helps ensure language-related tests accurately determine children's mental age and abilities. Accurate diagnosis helps educators identify conditions like partial deafness or dyslexia while avoiding misdiagnosis of mental retardation or language deficits. Recent advances in language acquisition research have significantly improved diagnostic reliability, though there may not be a lot and not have resolved deeper theoretical issues in linguistics, psychology, or philosophy of mind. This research continues to bridge the gap between theoretical understanding and practical applications. Evolution of grammatical theory. Traditional approaches. Normative, rationalist grammars focus on rules and ideal usage. Structural approaches examine language as systems of patterns and relationships. Functional approaches analyze language in terms of its communicative functions. Communicative approaches emphasize language as resources for meaning transmission. Grammatical theory has undergone a crucial shift from studying grammar as a set of rules to examining it in terms of its functions in daily communication. This evolution reflects changing perspectives on language's nature and purpose, moving from prescriptive approaches to more descriptive and functional understandings. Rationalist grammars. Port-Royal grammar. The Grammaire générale et raisonnée 1650 by Lancerot and Arnaud, also called Port-Royal grammar, was the first influential rationalist grammar. It built upon previous works like Minerva by the Spanish author El Brocense. Its philosophical foundation came from Descartes, who emphasized distinguishing truth from falsity through systematic doubt. This approach demanded fresh examination of established knowledge, similar to Chomsky's methodology. Key principles. Introspection was fundamental to this approach. Grammarians studied their own language production and thought, believing that language faculty was innate and independent of external factors. One major contribution of Port-Royal grammar was distinguishing between definite and indefinite articles, advancing our understanding of grammatical categories. Normative grammars. Prescriptive approach. Normative grammars attempted to prescribe how language should be used, establishing rules for correct usage based on prestigious examples. Contemporary gap. This approach often created a disconnect between prescribed rules and actual contemporary usage. Literary authority. These grammars relied on highly reputed authors, typically writers from previous centuries, to demonstrate optimal language use. Example, Ryle Grammar. Esbozo de una gramática del español by the Royal Spanish Academy exemplifies this approach, containing rules that often don't reflect present-day Spanish usage. Transitional approaches to grammar. Saussure and structuralism attempted to describe grammar as a structure of combining systems, viewing language itself as a social fact. Saussure's good work laid the foundation for modern linguistics by distinguishing between langue, language system, and parole, individual speech acts. Bloomfield and descriptivism, following Boas, aimed to describe newly discovered languages, especially Amerindian ones, from a theoretical perspective. Bloomfield adopted behaviorist perspectives, viewing language as a manifestation of internal human desires. The Sapir-Whorf hypothesis proposed that language and social culture are linked, suggesting people cannot conceptualize objects or feelings absent from their cultural experience. This hypothesis emphasized the relationship between language, thought, and cultural worldview. The Prague School, Functional Linguistics. Origin and approach. The Prague School originated with Czech linguist Mathesius, who gathered scholars for regular discussions from 1926 onwards. They practiced a distinctive form of synchronic linguistics that view language in terms of function. Unlike descriptivists and later transformational generativists, Prague linguists analyze languages to show the respective functions of various structural components in the use of their entire language. Functional analysis. They approach languages like engineers, examining engines, seeking to understand what jobs differ and different components perform and how one component's nature determines others, while they use concepts like phoneme and morpheme, similar to contemporaries, they went beyond description to explanation, addressing not just what languages were like, but why they were like that. One of the Mathesius' most influential contributions was the concept of functional sentence perspective, developed by scholars in this tradition. This hypothesis recognized that sentences are tailored to both convey new information and connect to what the hearer already knows and establish discourse context. Functional sentence perspective. Given information, what the listener already knows. Discourse context. Previously established communication. New information, what the speaker wants to convey. Sentence structure, organized to optimize information flow. The functional sentence perspective hypothesis recognizes that sentences aren't random pieces of information, but carefully constructed communications. Speakers tailor their statements considering not only what they want the listener to learn, but also what the listener already knows, and the discourse context they have established. This approach highlights the communicative function of grammatical structures. The London School. J.R. Firth's contribution. Academic pioneer. J.R. Firth became British first professor of general linguistics in 1944 at University College London, establishing a foundation for British linguistic research. Diverse interests. Firth's research spanned from phonology to semantics, but he particularly focused on language as a communication medium. Malinowski influence. His ideas were supported by ethnographer Malinowski, who studied communication systems in remote locations and viewed language as a means of transfusing ideas between speakers and listeners. Lasting impact. First concept of language as interrelated systems and as a communication vehicle influenced British scholars like Lyons and especially M.A.K. Halliday. Halliday and systemic grammar. Halliday has become the most influential British linguist in many aspects of linguistics. His theory of systematic grammar views language as sets of mutually exclusive options that operate at specific points in linguistic structure. This approach directly evolved from the Prague School's understanding of language and has significantly shaped modern functional linguistics. System of choices. Language as meaningful options. Functional perspective. Focus on what language does. Social context. Language embedded in social situations. Comparing Chomskyan and systemic approaches. Chomskyan perspective. In Chomsky's approach, grammar defines the class of word-formed sentences by providing rules for rewriting symbols as other symbols, starting with S, sentence, and following pre-established rules produces grammatical sentences. The system operates through transformations that may be optional, or mandatory, but the choices are never explicit. We don't know why particular transformations are applied. Systematic grammar. In systematic grammar, the central component is a chart showing all available choices in constructing a sentence with specified relationships between choices. The system explicitly shows when particular alternatives become available based on previous selections. This approach emphasizes meaningful choices within a structured system, explaining relationships between different grammatical options rather than just generating sentences. Systematic transitive choices. Intensive, extensive descriptive, extensive effective, extensive effectiveness. Communicative grammars, theoretical foundations. While communicative grammar lacks specific theoretical background, it has become a descriptive term in English language teaching. These grammars follow functionalist approaches in viewing language as resources for transmitting meaning. Halliday's influence. Halliday's work significantly influenced the development of notions created through grammatical or semantic constructions. His impact traces back to his lectures at the University of Edinburgh in the 1960s. Edinburgh School. Halliday fostered the Edinburgh School of Applied Linguistics, which produced leading scholars like Henry Widdowson, Gillian Brown, Keith Mitchell, and Tony Lynch. A prominent example of communicative grammar is Leach and Schwarzig's 1985 A Communicative Grammar of English, which presents a notional functional approach. It organizes language structure around functions or notions, criticizing, suggesting, complaining, and describes linguistic resources that create these sentences and these meanings. The notional functional approach. Communicative function. What the speaker intends to accomplish. Linguistic resources. Various ways to express the function. Practical application. Using appropriate forms in communication. Situational context. When and how each resource is appropriate. The notional functional approach reverses traditional grammar teaching by starting with language use and moving toward structure. Instead of beginning with grammatical forms and rules, it identifies communicative functions like apologizing, requesting, suggesting, and then explores the various linguistic resources available to express these functions in different contexts and registers. Phonology, the sound system. Articulatory phonetics studied how speech sounds are produced by the vocal organs. This includes understanding how the tongue, lips, vocal cords, and other articulators work together to create different consonants and vowels. Acoustic phonetics examines the physical properties of speech sounds as they travel through the air. This involves analyzing sound waves, frequencies, and other acoustic properties that distinguishes different speech sounds. Auditory phonetics focuses on how speech sounds are perceived and processed by the human ear and brain. This area explores how listeners distinguish between similar sounds and recognize speech in various conditions. Phonological components. Consonants. Sounds produced with some constriction in the vocal tract. Language vary in their consonant inventories, with some having as few as 6 and others more than 100 distinction and distinct consonant sounds. Vowels. Sounds produced with relatively open vocal tract. Vowel systems range from simple 3-vowel system to complex systems with dozens of distinct vowels, including a variation in length, nasalization, and tone. Stress. Relative prominence given to certain syllables within words or phrases. Stress patterns are crucial for word recognition and can distinguish between otherwise identical words in some languages. Intonation. Pitch patterns across phrases and sentences that convey grammatical and pragmatic meaning. Intonation can signal questions, statements, emphasis, and emotional states. These components form the foundation of a language sound system. Phonological analysis examines how these elements combine according to language-specific rules and constraints, creating the distinctive sound patterns of each language. Morphology, the structure of words. Morphology studies the internal structure of words and the rules governing their formation. It examines how morphemes, the smallest meaningful units in language, combine to create words with complex meanings. Morphological analysis reveals patterns in how languages build their vocabularies and express grammatical relationships. Languages vary dramatically in their morphological complexity. Some, like Vietnamese, have relatively simple morphology with few affixes, while others, like Turkish or Finnish, have extensive system of prefixes, suffixes, and other morphological processes that pack substantial information into single words. Types of morphemes. Free morphemes can stand alone as independent words like dog, run, happy. These form the core vocabulary of a language. and typically carry the primary lexical meaning in compound and complex words. Inflectional morphemes express grammatical relationships without changing word class, like plural s, past tense ed. These typically appear at word edges and create grammatical variants of the same lexical item. Bound morphemes must attach to other morphemes and cannot stand alone, for example, an, nes, or ing. These include prefixes, suffixes, and in some languages, infixes and circumfixes that modify meaning or indicate grammatical relationships. Derivational morphemes create new words, often changing word class, for example, shun, eyes, meant. These allow languages to expand their vocabulary by generating related words from existing terms, like rich, richness. Syntax, sentence structure, hierarchical structure. Sentences have multiple levels of organization, with phrases nested within phrases. This hierarchical arrangement allows for recursive structures and complex meaning relationships between sentence elements. Word order patterns. Language vary in basic word order. SVO, SOV, VSO, but most languages show consistent patterns that help speakers identify grammatical relationships between words. Transformational rules. Many syntactic theories propose that the complex sentences derive from simple structure through rule-governed operations that move, add, or delete elements while preserving core meaning. Syntactic constituents. Sentence, S, the complete syntactic unit expressing a proposition. Phrases, NP, VP, PP. Noun phrase, verb phrase, prepositional phrases. Groups of words functioning as single units. Words, noun, verb, adjective, etc. Individual lexical and functional items. Morphemes. Smallest meaningful units within words. Syntactic analysis identifies how words combine into increasingly larger units according to structural patterns. These patterns reveal the underlying grammatical organization that allows speakers to generate and understand an infinite variety of sentences using finite resources. Understanding constituent structure is essential for explaining how humans process complex linguistic information. Structure dependency in syntax. The principle. Structure dependency is a fundamental principle of syntax, stating that grammatical operations refer to structural relationships between elements, not just their linear order. This principle appears to be universal across human languages. For example, when forming questions in English, we don't simply move the first auxiliary verb to the beginning of the sentence. We move the auxiliary verb from the main clause, which requires understanding the hierarchical structure. Evidence. Consider this example. Statement. The man who is tall is happy. Question. Is the man who is tall happy? Correct. Not is the man who tall is happy? Incorrect. This demonstrates that question formation depends on understanding which belongs to the main clause, not just counting words or taking the first occurrence. Universal grammar core principles. Innate language faculty. Humans possess a genetically determined capacity for language acquisition that is specific to our species and separate from general cognitive abilities. Universal principles. All human languages share certain structural properties and constraints, despite their surface differences. These universals reflect the architecture of the language faculty. Parametric variation. Languages differ in limited, systematic ways that can be characterized as parameter settings within the universal framework, like switches set to different positions. Poverty of stimulus. Children acquire complex linguistic knowledge despite limited and imperfect input, suggesting innate constraints that guide the acquisition process. The lexicon, mental distinction, mental dictionary, phonological information, how words are pronounced, grammatical information, how words behave synthetically and syntactically, semantic information, what words mean and their relationships. The lexicon represents our mental dictionary, storing information about vocabulary items, including words and idioms. For each entry, the lexicon specifies pronunciation, phonological information, grammatical behavior, such as word class and subcategorization, and meaning, semantic properties and relationships to other words. Modern theories view the lexicon not as a static list, but as a dynamic network with complex connections between items based on sound, meaning, grammatical properties, and usage patterns. Semantics, the study of meaning. Phonological semantics. Meaning is expressed through stress, intonation, and other sound patterns. Pragmatic meaning. Meaning derived from context, speaker intention, and social conventions. Grammatical semantics. Meaning associated with grammatical categories like tense, aspect, mood, and sentence types. Lexical semantics. Meanings of individual vocabulary items and relationships between items. Semantics investigates how languages encode and express meaning. It examines meaning at multiple levels, from individual morphemes and word to phrases, sentences, and discourse. Semantic analysis reveals both language-specific meaning systems and potential universals in how humans conceptualize and categorize experience. Approaches to semantics: formal semantics, cognitive semantics, and lexical semantics. Formal semantics uses logic and mathematical models to represent meaning precisely. This approach focuses on truth conditions, entailment relationships, and the compositional meaning, showing how sentences meaning derives from word meanings and syntactic structures. Cognitive semantics examines how language reflects conceptual structures and cognitive processes. It explores metaphor, categorization, image schemas, and other cognitive mechanisms that shape how we express and understand meaning. Lexical semantics studies word meanings and relationships between words. This includes analyzing semantic features, polysemy, multiple related meanings, semantic fields, and lexical networks that organize vocabulary. These approaches offer complementary perspectives on linguistic meaning. Formal semantics provides precision and explicit rules for meaning composition. Cognitive semantics connects language to broader mental processes. And lexical semantics reveals the organization of vocabulary knowledge. Language acquisition theories. Nativist theories, usage-based theories. Championed by Chomsky and followers, these theories propose that humans have an innate language acquisition device, LAD, or universal grammar that guides the language learning process. That's why these are called nativists. They emphasize the poverty of stimulus argument. Children receive insufficient input to learn language through general learning mechanisms alone. Evidence includes that universality of acquisition stages across languages and children's ability to generate novel sentences they have never heard. Usage-based theories, proposed by researchers like Tomasello. These theories suggest that children learn language through general cognitive mechanisms and exposure to language in use. They emphasize pattern recognition, statistical learning, and social pragmatic understanding. Evidence includes correlations between input frequency and acquisition order, and the gradual, item-specific nature of early grammatical development. Critical period hypothesis. From 0 to 3, early childhood, optimal period for phonological acquisition. 4 to 7, middle childhood, strong grammatical acquisition abilities. 8 to 12, late childhood, declining ease of native-like acquisition. 13 plus, post-puberty, significantly more difficult to achieve native-like proficiency. The critical period hypothesis suggests that there is a biologically determined period during which language acquisition is most efficient. After this period, acquiring language, especially with native-like proficiency, becomes more difficult due to the decreased neutral plasticity and neural plasticity established cognitive patterns. Evidence includes cases of language deprivation, second language acquisition outcomes at different ages, and neuroimaging studies showing different brain activation patterns for early versus late learners. Implications for language teaching. Developmental readiness. Understanding acquisition sequences helps teachers present material when learners are cognitively ready and rather than following arbitrary curricular sequences. Comprehensible input. Providing language slightly above learners' current level, I+1, supports natural acquisition processes while maintaining comprehensibility. Form meaning balance. Effective teaching balances attention to grammatical form with meaningful communication, recognizing that both are necessary for complete language proficiency. Individual variation. Acknowledging differences in learning styles, aptitude, and motivation helps learners provide appropriate support for diverse learners. Grammar teaching approaches. Grammar translation method. Focus on explicit rule learning and translation between languages. Emphasize reading literary text and memorizing vocabulary lists. Audiolingual method, based on behaviorist principles of habit formation through pattern drills and memorization. Prioritize spoken language over written forms. Communicative language teaching. Emphasize meaningful interaction and authentic communication. Grammar taught inductively through communicative tasks. Focus on form. Integrated approach drawing attention to grammatical features within meaningful context. Combines explicit and implicit learning. Functional communicative grammar teaching. Function-first approach. Organizes teaching around communicative functions, requesting, apologizing, suggesting, rather than grammatical structures. Students learn various ways to express the same function. Contextual appropriateness emphasizes how context determines which grammatical forms are appropriate. Students learn to select forms based on formality, relationship between speakers, and communication purposes. Authentic materials uses real-world language samples rather than artificially constructed examples. Students encounter grammar as it actually functions in natural communication. Task-based learning embeds grammar learning within meaningful tasks that require communication. Grammar emerges from the need to express specific meanings effectively. Grammar in context, discourse perspective, beyond sentence level. Traditional grammar teaching often focuses on sentence-level structures in isolation. A discourse perspective examines how grammatical choices create cohesion and coherence across longer stretches of text or conversations. This approach reveals how grammar serves to organize information, maintain reference to people and objects, signal relationships between ideas, and create text that flows logically. Key discourse features. From a discourse perspective, important grammatical features include reference devices, pronouns, articles, connectives and transition markers, tense, consistency and shifts, information structure, given versus new, thematic progression patterns. Grammar and pragmatics. Speech acts. Different grammatical structures can perform the same speech act. Requesting, promising, apologizing, and the same structure can perform different acts depending on context. Understanding this relationship is crucial for effective communication. Politeness strategies. Grammar provides resources for expressing politeness and managing face threats. Modal verbs, conditionals, questions, and indirect forms allow speakers to modulate the force of their utterances based on social relationships. Implicature. Grammatical choices can generate conversational implicatures, meaning that are communicated indirectly. Teaching grammar should include how structural choices contribute to implied meanings beyond literal content. Pragmatic competence requires understanding not just what grammatical structures mean literally, but how they function in social interaction. Effective grammar teaching integrates pragmatic dimensions to help learners communicate appropriately in various contexts. Grammar assessment, discrete point testing. Traditional approach testing isolated grammatical knowledge through exercises like multiple choice, gap filling, and error correction. Measures explicit knowledge but may not reflect ability to use grammar in communication. Integrated assessment evaluates grammar within meaningful language production through essays, presentations, and conversations. Measures how well learners can deploy grammatical knowledge for authentic communication. Performance assessment assesses grammatical competence during task completion, focusing on how effectively grammar serves communicative goals rather than just formal accuracy. Technology in grammar teaching. Technology has transformed grammar teaching by providing new tools for instruction, practice, and assessment. Adaptive learning platforms can personalize grammar instruction based on individual needs, while corpus tools allow teachers and students to explore how grammar functions in authentic language use. Digital tools also enable more engaging practice through gamification, immediate feedback, and multimodal presentation. Virtual environments and AI conversation partners create opportunities for contextualized grammar practice that traditional methods cannot provide. Grammar teaching for special purposes. Academic English focuses on complex sentence structures, nominalizations, passive voice, hedging devices, and other features common in academic discourse. Emphasizes precision and objectivity in expression. Business English prioritizes clear communication, appropriate formality levels, and structures for specific functions like negotiating, presenting data, and maintaining professional relationships. Technical English emphasizes concise structures, precise terminology, and clear organizational patterns for instructions, specifications, and documentation. Creative writing explores how grammatical choices create stylistic effects, establish voice, and enhance narrative or poetic impacts. Encourages intentional rule-breaking for effects. Effective grammar teaching for special purposes identifies the specific grammatical features most relevant to particular domains and contexts. It helps learners develop grammatical competence tailored to their communication needs. Future directions in grammar research and teaching. Neurolinguistic insights. Advances in brain imaging will provide deeper understanding of how grammar is processed and acquired, potentially in resolving theoretical debates. Corpus-informed pedagogy. Increasingly sophisticated corpus analysis will reveal actual patterns of grammatical usage, challenging prescriptive rules and informing more authentic teaching. World English's perspective. Greater recognition of grammatical variation across English varieties will shift from monolithic standard to pluralistic understanding of acceptable forms. AI-enhanced learning. Artificial intelligence will enable more personalized grammar instruction and provide sophisticated analysis of learning production. This is the bibliography we have used. Primary sources: Lyons, J. 1981, Language and Linguistics, Cambridge. Marcos Maurer, 1990, Introducción a la Lingüística, Historia y Modelos, Síntesis. Sampson, 1980, School of Linguistics, Hutchinson University Library. These sources provide comprehensive coverage of the topics discussed throughout this presentation, from theoretical foundations of grammar to practical applications in language teaching. For further exploration of specific areas, consult the specialized works in psycholinguistics, language acquisition, and grammatical theory listed in the additional references. Chomsky, 1965, Aspect of the Theory of Syntax, MIT Press. Halliday, 1985, An Introduction to Functional Grammar, Edwards Arnold. Leach and Stardwick, 1986, A Communicative Grammar of English, Longman. Pinker, 1984, The Language Instinct, William Morrow and Company. Thank you for this wonderful time.